What's up, everybody? Max Scoville here. I'm with Joel Bylos from Funcom. We are here to talk about Dune Awakening. I think we should address the shy halud in the room. We got life-size worms out here. So I've seen a lot of buzz around this game. It looks awesome. It's a Dune game, but there's also seems to be some sort of like confusion of like what type of game. It's a survival MMORPG. I've seen people be like, "Is it Conan Exiles in space?" How do you pitch this?
Yeah. So it sort of starts off with this really strong survival angle. Like, I consider it like a V shape. You start in the focused survival part of the V, and then you move up and it becomes more of political survival, social, MMO, working with other players, working with large guilds. The initial premise of the game was just, hey, how do we take a survival game and give it a good end game? And the conclusion to that in Dune was like political survival, big world, you know?
That is a complex answer. Dune is like it's such complex lore to kind of put together. Where does this fall in the canon?
Yeah, so we worked with the Herbert estate and we sort of went with like this alternate universe where instead of Paul being born, Jessica followed her orders from the Bene Gesserit, gave birth to a daughter, right? And then that shifts the landscape of everything. So we kind of did this for two reasons. One, it sets up the ability to have Harkonnen and Atreides on the planet fighting each other. It also means that people who've read the books and seen the movies have something to look forward to in our game because there's something slightly different about it, right?
Okay, so it's kind of like a what-if scenario. That's cool. Now I gotta ask, the Bene Gesserit kind of psychic stuff, how are you approaching the more supernatural elements?
So, I mean, like, Spice has its own kind of special stuff going on, and I probably shouldn't spoil too much, but it's cool if you take enough Spice. Things will happen.
Okay,
and,
interesting.
And then the Bene Gesserit themselves, like the Mentats, all of these kind of special things from the universe, you can learn them as archetypes. You can meet trainers in the world who will teach you a little bit of the ability. Like, you can't really become a Bene Gesserit, but you can learn some of their abilities. You can learn to use the voice, and then you can use that, say, in combat to compel an enemy to come charging at you, right? Or you can use it to make people not see you. You can tell them, like, ignore me.
Okay.
And they won't pay attention to you for a little while. So, yeah, it's kind of, that's how we built it into the game.
So you can't say too much, but what does Spice do in the game? Is it treated like it's a resource, obviously? But
it's kind of Spice is kind of at the heart of everything, right? Like, so first of all, when you come to Arrakis, your character isn't really that used to Spice. So after a little while, they start to have, a moment, right? Paul has one like that in the movie as well. The player starts to have a little moment, and it sets him on this journey through the world. And so Spice is kind of, it's there as like a guide, a spiritual guide. It works as like something that fuels your growth, your abilities. It also works as like a currency for which you pay tax to the Emperor for building on Arrakis, right? And it also works to bribe people in the political system. So Spice has a lot of uses.
There's a lot going on here. So aside from the water of life, what about actual water? So how does that come into play? Like, this is a sandbox game in maybe the worst way because you're gonna you die of thirst.
Yeah, so we built in like a bunch of mechanics for getting water. Starting off, you're kind of scrabbling to survive, so you're sucking moisture out of plants because you're not Fremen, you don't know how to live here in the desert, right? But then over time you learn to like pull the blood out of your enemies, extract it, take it to a machine, purify it, then you start taking water from there. Eventually you get like a dew reaper, which allows you to sort of walk around sucking the water off plants, like wilting them as you go. And then eventually, move up to the high levels of harvesting. Corpses to put in your death still to give you lots of water. So you are kind of moving through the progression of water in the game.
That is gnarly. Now, I know there is some apprehension because like survival games have a lot of griefing and MMOs have a lot of grinding. What accommodations are you taking to sort of make this accessible for people who just want to play a Dune game?
Yeah, I mean, so we're trying to sort of tutorialize well, explain to people the world. There's a little single player section at the start of the game before you enter the main world. And in that single player section, we teach you the basic mechanics. We teach you a little bit about the lore. We give you a story. And then we put you into the world and sort of have you survive. I mean, I don't think the game is going to be for everybody. If you hate survival games, it's not going to be a game that you want to play, right? Like, so I have to be clear about that. I don't like to sell games to people who don't want to play them. So, but at the end of the day, like it's kind of, there's enough there. It's forgiving enough. You learn the mechanics. You learn not to walk on the sand when the sandworms are around. You learn how to get water. You'll be fine.
Now let's talk about the walking. A wise man once said, walk without rhythm and you won't attract the worm. We see the guy in the gameplay trailer you just dropped is walking pretty purposefully and pretty rhythmically. Can you do the silly walk?
You can't because you're not Fremen and you haven't learned it. But it is something that you can learn later in the game, hopefully, right? Like, so you get further into the game, maybe you learn some skills about this, but not in the beginning, right? Because so some of our players in beta, they're like, oh, I'm walking like an idiot on the sand. I'm not using any rhythm. The sandworm still comes. And I'm like, you don't know how to sandwalk, man.
Okay, yeah, you gotta learn the ways. Now let's talk about the worms. How do you incorporate a giant, kilometer-wide worm into a game? That's a pretty massive even for an MMO.
Yeah, so the worms themselves, like there's two sizes. We have the small worms, which are like this guy, and then we have the Shia, the really big chungus that comes out, So the idea is that, like, yeah, when you're walking on the sand, you create vibrations every time you walk on the sand or drive or ride a vehicle or anything, right? The sandworm will always come. It's this huge AI that's moving around, so it's actually there in the world all the time. It's not something we spawn. It's not some scripted trick. It's following and listening, right? And it comes after players in the world. And then when you get to the deep desert, the harvesting areas, that's where the really big worms show up.
Okay, so they're just out there. They're like constantly part of the environment.
Yeah, it's like a shark, right? You got to think about. You go into the water, you hear the Jaws music, you start walking on the sand, and you feel like, okay, there's tension. The sandworm is going to come, and it's just a matter of time.
Okay, that's terrifying. I want to talk about combat a little bit. There's a lot of gunplay we see in the trailer. Obviously, there's the close quarters combat and knife fighting. How are you striking a balance between ranged and melee?
Yeah, so Dune has a really interesting shield mechanic, right? And it's part of the lore that, like, shields basically rebuff all projectiles. So the way the game works is that we have this, enemies use shields, they use ranged. So it's kind of about getting in and out of combat very quickly, getting close to the people in melee, pulling back to use ranged on people who don't have shields. And then, of course, like, we have abilities which allow you to do this, to get in and out. I mentioned Compel, but there's things like the Shigawire Claw, which let you pull yourself into an enemy or force them to stumble. There's all sorts of stuff for moving around the battlefield. So, yeah, it's kind of this combined arms, we call it, this combination of melee, ranged, and abilities.
We also see some climbing. What are the traversal options here?
Yeah, so the climbing is freeform, right? Like, we're sort of in Conan Exiles, we had like freeform climbing. In Dune, we have a sort of more advanced version of that where you can climb on anything, but in addition, you can use abilities or suspensor belts. So once you get a suspensor belt, you can kind of just fly, right? You see it in the movies as well. You just sort of fly around in the world as long as your power lasts. And then, yeah, obviously climbing is just freeform attached to a surface, start climbing.
Awesome. Early access, what are the plans for people getting their hands on it?
Yeah, so we're doing a persistent beta right now. We'll be adding thousands and thousands of more people to it as we progress towards the launch window, getting more people in to test the endgame systems and the large faction stuff. And then we're looking for an early, we're not saying early access, we're saying early 2025 launch window.
Cool. Well, I'm dying to check it out. Arrakis sounds brutal and unforgiving, and I want to get eaten by a worm.